In 1848, the world's greatest treasure hunt began at a sawmill on the American River in California, and within 2 years, hundreds of thousands of men had arrived from every continent on Earth, willing to eat almost anything to stay alive long enough to get rich. What they actually ate has been almost entirely erased from the romantic mythology of the gold rush. Tonight, we are putting it back. 25 real meals, from the desperate to the ingenious, that kept the 49ers alive. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The California Gold Rush of 1848 to 1855 produced more historical mythology than almost any event in American history. The image that survives is sun-baked men with pickaxes and gold pans, rugged individualists chasing fortune. The food is conspicuously absent from that image because the food tells a story that does not fit the mythology. It is a story of scarcity so severe that men paid prices extraordinary even by modern standards for the most basic foodstuffs. A single egg in 1849 San Francisco cost $1, roughly $30 today. A pound of flour cost $4. A single potato cost as much as $1. Men who arrived with capital found it depleted within weeks. Men who arrived without it found themselves working not for gold, but for food. What awaited them was a region with virtually no agricultural infrastructure, where the only food reliably available was whatever could be shipped to San Francisco and then hauled into the hills. The native food systems of California's tribes had been disrupted, but not yet replaced. The journey west, whether overland or around Cape Horn, had consumed most of whatever supplies a man had started with. This is the context within which the 25 meals that follow were eaten. Meal 1. Straight flour paste. Before we get to anything more complex, we need to start at the bottom. The simplest and most desperate food eaten in the California goldfields was raw flour mixed with water and consumed without cooking. Not bread, not biscuit, just flour and water, stirred together in a tin cup or a hat, eaten with a spoon or your fingers. Men who had run out of everything else, including the fuel to cook, ate this and called it a meal. Accounts from 1849 and 1850 describe men eating flour paste for days at a time during particularly lean periods, surviving on the calories without any of the palatability that cooking would have provided. This is where the story starts because it tells you the baseline. Everything else we discuss represents an improvement on flour paste, and understanding that helps explain why miners were willing to eat things that would be unthinkable under ordinary circumstances. Meal 2. Hardtack. Hardtack was the universal emergency food of the 19th century, consumed by soldiers, sailors, and anyone else who needed something that would not spoil quickly and could be stored indefinitely. It is a cracker made from nothing but flour, water, and salt, baked until every molecule of moisture has been driven out, producing something that will remain edible for months or years as long as it stays dry. The Goldfield version was often called pilot bread or ship's biscuit, and it came in enormous quantities on the ships that supplied California. But the problem with hardtack was that eating it without preparation was an experience that tested the commitment of even the hungriest man. It was so hard that biting into it directly risked breaking teeth, a problem that, in an era before dentistry, was genuinely serious. The standard preparation was to soak hardtack in water until it softened, then fry it in whatever grease was available, or to crumble it into boiling water to make a paste that was slightly more edible than straight flour paste. A miner with access to a little salt pork grease might fry his soaked hardtack into something approximating a savory pancake. This qualified as a good meal in the goldfields of 1849. Meal 3. Sourdough bread. This is the meal that became legendary, and it deserves its legend, though the legend understates how much necessity drove the art. San Francisco sourdough starter cultures, living colonies of wild yeast and bacteria that fermented flour and water without any commercial yeast, became the foundation of Goldfield bread because they were the only reliable leavening available in a place where commercial yeast could not be transported or stored reliably. Miners carried their starters in pouches against their bodies to keep them warm, fed them scraps of flour, and nursed them through the conditions of the goldfields with the same attention they gave to their tools. The bread that resulted was dense, chewy, and aggressively sour, a flavor profile that was partly the result of the specific wild yeasts present in the San Francisco Bay Area, and partly the result of the long fermentation times that miners' schedules and limited fuel supplies imposed. You started the bread when you could, baked it when you could, and ate it when it was done, regardless of whether it had risen quite enough or been quite as thoroughly baked as you might have wished. The sourdough cultures that survived the gold rush became the ancestors of the San Francisco sourdough strains that are still maintained and used today. Meal 4. Flapjacks. If sourdough bread was the gold standard of Goldfield bread, flapjacks were the democratic standard of the griddle. A flapjack in the 1849 Goldfields was a simple pancake made from flour, water, salt, and whatever leavening you had available, cooked on a flat iron pan over a fire. Miners ate them at every meal, including dinner, because they were the fastest way to convert raw flour into something hot and edible. The flavor varied enormously depending on what you had to put on them. A man with access to molasses had a luxury product. A man with nothing to put on them ate them plain and was grateful for the hot food. The cooking of flapjacks became a Goldfield skill in itself. A properly flipped flapjack, cooked on a pan seasoned with accumulated bacon grease, with the right combination of chewiness and char, was the mark of a man who knew what he was doing in the Goldfield kitchen. The flapjack flip, the moment when the cake was tossed into the air and caught on the other side, became a minor performance that men competed over in the social world of the mining camp. Meal 5. Pork and beans. Salt pork was the primary protein of the California Goldfields, not by preference but by necessity. Yet pork could be preserved with salt in ways that other meats could not, and salt pork traveled well enough to be one of the few protein sources available in consistent supply to California during the rush years. Dried beans, similarly, were shelf-stable and could be transported without significant loss. The combination of salt pork and beans became the default protein meal of the Goldfields in the way that hardtack and flour paste were the default carbohydrate meals. The preparation was simple and slow. Beans were soaked overnight if you had the planning capacity and the water, then simmered with a chunk of salt pork for several hours until both were tender. The pork rendered its fat into the cooking liquid, flavoring the beans and adding caloric density. The result was filling, salty, and deeply satisfying in the way that only a meal prepared slowly and eaten after hard physical labors can be satisfying. Diaries from the Goldfields describe meals of pork and beans with a warmth that suggests they represented genuine comfort in difficult circumstances. Meal 6. Carne seca. The California Goldfields sat in a region with a deep Spanish and Mexican culinary tradition, and one of the most important contributions of that tradition to Goldfield eating was carne seca, dried beef made by cutting beef into thin strips and drying them in the sun or over low heat until almost all the moisture was removed. The product was hard, intensely flavored, and extraordinarily shelf-stable, lasting for months without refrigeration. California ranchers and Mexican miners brought carne seca into the Goldfields in significant quantities. The technique spread rapidly to other mining communities because its utility was immediately obvious. A miner who had access to a supply of carne seca could carry several days' worth of protein in a small pouch on his belt, requiring no cooking equipment and no fire. The dried beef could be eaten as is, chewy and intensely salty, or rehydrated in water and added to beans or stews to produce something more complex. Carne seca is the direct ancestor of American beef jerky, and its presence in the Goldfields was one of the mechanisms by which Mexican food culture entered and shaped American Western cooking. Meal 7. Pinole. Less well known than carne seca, but equally important, is pinole. Another contribution of the Spanish and Mexican culinary tradition that had deep roots in the indigenous food cultures of California and the Southwest. Pinole is toasted ground corn, often mixed with sugar and spices like cinnamon, consumed by mixing a portion with water to create a thick drink or paste. It is extraordinarily nutritious relative to its weight and volume, shelf-stable, and requires no cooking to consume. Indigenous California tribes had developed similar preparations from local seeds and grains long before Spanish contact, and the concept of a storable, portable, nutritious grain preparation was well suited to the conditions of gold mining. Mexican miners introduced pinole to the camps, and while it never achieved the widespread adoption of beans or salt pork, and it circulated through the Goldfields as a trail food and emergency ration that men who had encountered it praised for its practical utility. A small bag of pinole could sustain a miner for a day of work if nothing else was available. Meal 8. Venison. The Sierra Nevada foothills that contain the primary gold-bearing streams of the California Goldfields were also, in 1849, extraordinarily rich in wildlife. Deer were abundant in the region before the mining rush, and in the first years of the rush, before the sheer number of hunters had made game scarce, venison was one of the most important supplementary protein sources for Goldfield miners. Hunting was not a reliable food strategy for most miners because it required time away from mining, which represented a direct economic cost. But men who were already skilled hunters, and particularly men who had come overland and had developed hunting skills on the crossing, found that a day's hunting could provide several days' worth of meat for their camp. The preparation was simple because the conditions demanded simplicity. Venison was cut into steaks and cooked over a fire, or it was stewed with whatever vegetables were available, or it was dried in the manner of carne seca to produce a shelf-stable product that could be eaten over subsequent days. By 1851 and 1852, hunting pressure had so reduced the wildlife of the foothills that venison became a luxury rather than a staple, another casualty of the scale of the rush. Meal 10, jackrabbit, where grizzly bear represented a large, dangerous, and relatively rare hunting opportunity. Jackrabbits represented the opposite. They were small, fast, and abundant throughout the foothills and the Central Valley, requiring no special equipment to hunt beyond a club or a thrown stone for a lucky or skilled hunter, or a simple snare set overnight. A jackrabbit provided 1 to 2 pounds of lean, mild meat that could be cooked quickly over a fire. The lean nature of jackrabbit meat was its primary limitation. Without fat to add moisture and flavor, jackrabbit cooked over a direct fire could be stringy and dry. Miners who had access to salt pork grease or bear fat would use it to baste jackrabbit during cooking, producing something considerably more palatable. Others simply accepted the dryness as the price of free protein. In a region where a single egg cost $1, free protein was not something to be dismissed regardless of its texture. Meal 12, Chinese rice and salted fish. The Chinese miners who arrived in California, primarily from Guangdong province, brought with them a food culture and food supply infrastructure that was markedly different from the American and European baseline of the gold fields. Chinese merchants established supply chains that brought goods from San Francisco Chinatown into the mining camps, including rice, dried and salted fish, dried mushrooms, preserved vegetables, and a range of condiments that gave Chinese miners access to flavors and nutritional diversity unavailable to most of their fellow miners. Rice was the Chinese staple where flour was the American staple, and the difference mattered. Rice cooked more quickly than beans, produced a complete carbohydrate meal with minimal preparation, and could be combined with small quantities of dried fish or preserved vegetables to create something that was nutritionally adequate and flavorful in ways that hardtack and pork fat were not. Observers in the goldfields consistently noted that Chinese miners appeared better nourished than their American counterparts, an observation that reflects the superiority of the Chinese food supply system as much as any other factor. Meal 14, frijoles de la olla. The Mexican and Latin American miners who came to California in significant numbers, particularly from Sonora in Mexico and from Chile, brought with them the bean cooking traditions of their home regions. Frijoles de la olla, beans of the pot, were whole pinto or black beans simmered slowly in a clay pot or iron kettle with water, salt, onions when available. Yatsan sometimes a piece of lard or salt pork until they were completely tender and had produced a rich, slightly thick cooking broth. The difference between frijoles de la olla and the simpler pork and beans of American goldfield cooking was primarily technique and time. The Mexican version emphasized the beans' natural creaminess, achieved through longer cooking and the use of the beans' own starches to thicken the broth, rather than the American emphasis on the salt pork as the primary flavor element. Sonoran miners were observed eating frijoles de la olla with tortillas, a combination that provided complete protein and was recognized even by American miners as superior to their own bean preparations. Meal 16, clam chowder. San Francisco Bay had been, before the gold rush, and home to an extraordinary abundance of clams and oysters. The first years of the rush saw extensive harvesting of these shellfish by miners who traveled through San Francisco on their way to the gold fields, and by the coastal communities that supplied the mining camps. Clam chowder, made from fresh clams, potatoes when available, salt pork, and cream when accessible, was a regular feature of the better eating houses in San Francisco, and in the more established mining camps that had access to supply lines from the coast. This is not the meal of a desperate miner eating flour paste in a remote ravine. This is the meal of the slightly more established camp, the camp that had a cook, a reliable supply route, and a few amenities. Clam chowder in the goldfields represented the aspirational end of goldfield eating, the meal that reminded men of home cooking and of the fact that good food was possible even in these circumstances if you had the resources and the organization to produce it. Meal 19, dried apple pie. This entry requires a moment of explanation because it sits at the luxury end of the goldfield food spectrum, available only to camps with sufficient organization, resources, and cooking equipment to produce it. Dried apples were one of the more practical forms in which fruit could be transported to California. They weighed a fraction of fresh apples, were shelf-stable, and could be rehydrated with water to produce something that at least suggested the flavor of fresh fruit. A miner who had dried apples, flour, grease for the crust, and a Dutch oven or reflector oven for baking could produce something that contemporaries called apple pie, though it bore limited resemblance to what that phrase suggests today. The crust was made from lard or whatever animal fat was available. The filling from rehydrated dried apples sweetened with molasses or sugar when available. The result was dense, slightly gummy, and to men who had been eating hardtack and salt pork for months, an emotional experience as much as a culinary one. Diaries describe dried apple pie as producing genuine happiness in the men who ate it. Meal 20. Sonoran tortillas. The flour tortilla, as prepared by the Sonoran miners who came to California, was one of the most practically efficient foods in the goldfields, made from flour, water, lard, and salt. Now worked into a smooth dough and rolled thin before cooking on a dry griddle. A tortilla required less fuel to cook than bread, less time than biscuits, and produced a flexible, portable result that could be eaten plain, wrapped around beans or meat, or used to scoop food directly from a pot. The Sonoran miners were extraordinarily skilled at tortilla making, producing large, thin, flexible rounds in minutes from a small fire and a minimal cooking surface. American miners who observed them were frequently impressed enough to attempt the technique themselves, with varying success. The tortilla spread gradually through the goldfields as practical efficiency rather than culinary preference, adopted by men who recognized that it was simply a better bread-making technology for the conditions they were working in. Meal 22. All chilaquiles. Where mole represents the peak of Mexican goldfield cooking, chilaquiles represent its practical middle ground, the meal that required real ingredients but not extravagant ones. Chilaquiles are essentially a preparation of stale or day-old tortillas, torn or cut into pieces, simmered briefly in a sauce of dried or fresh chilies, and topped with whatever protein and garnishes were available. It is a peasant dish in the best sense, a way of using leftover starch to create something satisfying and flavorful. In the goldfield context, chilaquiles were a mechanism for using tortillas that had become too dry and brittle to eat comfortably on their own. Rather than discarding them, a cook would tear them into pieces, prepare a quick sauce from dried chilies that were part of the standard Mexican camp pantry, and combine the two with whatever protein was at hand, perhaps a little carne seca or a few beans. The result was a meal that took advantage of the flavors that had developed in the stale tortillas, while using them in a form where their texture no longer mattered. Meal 23. Stewed prunes. This meal seems almost comic in the context of Gold Rush mythology until you understand the desperation for anything sweet, anything fresh-tasting, anything that was not salt and starch. Dried prunes were one of the more practical forms of preserved fruit available in California, less expensive than dried apples, shelf-stable, and capable of being rehydrated into something that provided both sweetness and the vitamin C that was absent from the baseline goldfield diet. Scurvy, the disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a genuine threat in the goldfields. Men who lived exclusively on salt pork, hardtack, and flour for extended periods without access to fresh fruit or vegetables developed symptoms of scurvy, including bleeding gums, joint pain, and slow wound healing that were recognized even if not fully understood by the medical knowledge of the era. Stewed prunes were one of the practical responses to this threat. A daily portion of prunes simmered in water until soft and eaten with their cooking liquid provided enough vitamin C to prevent or reverse early scurvy, while providing the sweetness that men craved almost as much as they craved protein. Meal 24. Lamb's quarters and miner's lettuce salad. Lamb's quarters, a wild green that grows throughout California and much of North America. Was known by the 49ers primarily through its variants eaten by indigenous Californians and by men who had encountered it during overland crossings. Miner's lettuce, a succulent green that grows abundantly in shaded moist areas throughout the California foothills, acquired its name directly from the gold rush because miners discovered it growing near their camps and recognized it as edible. Both plants could be eaten raw, requiring no cooking and no equipment beyond the hand that picked them. They provided vitamins and minerals that the baseline goldfield diet lacked entirely, and their discovery in or near a camp was treated as a genuine windfall by men who understood, even without formal nutritional knowledge, that their teeth were loosening and their energy was declining in ways that suggested their diet was deficient. A salad of miner's lettuce and lamb's quarters, eaten with a little salt if available, was medicine as much as food. Meal 25. Christmas dinner. The 25th meal on this list is not a specific dish, but a specific occasion, because the records of Goldfield Christmases are some of the most illuminating documents in the social history of the gold rush. Men who spent months eating hardtack and salt pork and flour paste described in diaries and letters home extraordinary efforts to produce something worthy of the occasion when Christmas arrived. What these Christmas dinners actually contained varied enormously by camp, by year, and by the resources available. The earliest records, from Christmas 1849, when supply chains were still underdeveloped, describe dinners that were only marginally better than the daily ration. Perhaps a slightly larger quantity of beans, perhaps a special allocation of sugar or molasses for a sweetened dish, perhaps a bottle of California brandy or Chilean wine shared among the camp members. Later records from 1851 and 1852, when supply infrastructure had improved, describe genuine feast preparations: roasted venison or pork, dried apple pie, biscuits made with actual leavening, and in some cases oysters brought from San Francisco or canned goods that had arrived from the eastern states. The universal element across all the Christmas dinner accounts is the effort. Men who cooked almost nothing throughout the year spent days preparing for Christmas. Men who ate alone in their claims ate together on Christmas. Men who had saved a special item, a tin of sardines, a small bottle of brandy, a packet of dried fruit, that brought it out for the occasion. The Christmas dinner of the California Goldfields was not primarily a culinary event. It was a statement about humanity, about the refusal to let circumstances entirely define what a person was and what a person deserved. That impulse, the impulse to eat well despite everything, to find flavor and pleasure and community in the most desperate conditions, runs through all 25 meals on this list. The flour paste and the chilaquiles and the Christmas venison are separated by enormous distances of resources, skill, and cultural tradition. But they are connected by the same fundamental human need to eat, and by the same fundamental human impulse to make that eating as good as circumstances allow. That impulse is not a luxury. It is the thing that separates survival from living, and it was as present in the Goldfields as anywhere else the human story has unfolded. The men who ate these meals in the hills and valleys of California in the years of the gold rush were from every corner of the world. They spoke different languages and came from different culinary traditions and had different relationships to the food they were eating. What they shared was the willingness to work desperately hard in a strange landscape for the chance of wealth, and the necessity of eating whatever was available to sustain that work. The food they ate is the most honest record of what the gold rush actually was, before the mythology made it something else. And those are 25 meals that kept the 49ers alive. From flour paste and sourdough to mole de guajolote and Christmas dinner in the mountains. The gold rush was fed by desperation, ingenuity, and the food traditions of a dozen nations arriving in one place at one impossible moment. What they ate tells you more about who they were than anything the mythology ever did. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.